I'm Dr. Catherine Hughes from Crime Psych. Today I'm going to be doing a psychological analysis of Fred West. For the more sensitive viewers, I must warn you that this episode contains themes surrounding sexual abuse, child abuse, murder, dismemberment, rape and incest. First of all, I'm going to give you a very brief overview of the case and of the offender, look at Fred West's upbringing, and then look at his adult life and the sequence of events that led him and Rose West to kill. Most, if not all of you, will have heard about Fred and Rosemary West. I did a video a little while back doing a psychological analysis of them, but it was one of the earlier videos, so it didn't include perhaps as much information as what it could have done, so I'm covering it again today. Fred West is an English serial killer, and he committed at least 12 murders between 1967 and 1987 in Gloucestershire in the UK. All of his victims were young women. At least 8 of these murders involved the West's sexual gratification, and they included acts such as rape, bondage, torture and mutilation. The victims' dismembered bodies were either burnt in the cellar or they were buried in the garden of their home, which was in Cromwell Street in Gloucestershire. Fred West is known to have committed at least 2 murders on his own, and this included his stepdaughter, Charmaine. Fred and Rose West were apprehended and they were charged in 1994. Fred West killed himself in prison while he was on remand, and so he never stood trial and was never sentenced. He and Rose were convicted of 9 joint murders, and Fred with a further 4. Rose was sentenced to 10 life terms in prison with a minimum of a whole life order. This section examining Fred West's upbringing and childhood is a little bit longer than I've done on other offenders, and that's simply because there is just lots of information available on him. However, what it does show is the development of anger, rage and aggression, alongside him becoming increasingly more deviant. Fred was born into quite a strict family life. His father was a very strict disciplinarian. His mother was described as being overly possessive. He was described as somewhat of a mummy's boy, and she was very protective over him. The family grew up on a farm, with all of the children having to do their jobs and take part in farm life. Fred West is described as being quite socially inept with other people. He relied on his siblings for any sort of social interaction. The family itself was quite a closed family unit. They kept very much to themselves, and so they weren't ever really allowed to socialise with anybody outside of the home. Fred West describes growing up with his father raping some of his siblings, and suggested that his own mother introduced him to sex when he was just 12 years old. Although details of that have been disputed by close family members over the year, some of them have suggested that Fred West is just a pathological liar and that it simply never happened. Fred claimed that he was introduced to sex by his mother at the age of 12. He claimed that his father taught him how to engage in bestiality in his early teens. He's also claimed to have cut the throat of a pig when he was very young. However, his brother Doug has claimed that that is untrue. He also says that none of his sisters were abused and raped by their father. I'll consider the possibility that it did happen, and also consider the possibility that it didn't. If the abuse did take place, it can be observed and copied by the siblings. We often learn from those who are closest to us. We watch how our parents behave, we watch how our friends and our extended family members behave, and we tend to copy what we see on a daily basis. And this can happen for both positive and negative type behaviours. So if we're brought up to do chores, to do homework on time, to respect others, to listen to other people, then we tend to copy those types of behaviours. But it can also extend into the negative behaviours such as domestic abuse or rape, threats or violence or theft, or in fact any type of criminal activity. We tend to copy what we see on a day-to-day basis. And this is what Fred West said that he's seen on a daily basis and was therefore modelling that behaviour. His mother took sex from him and his father took sex from his siblings. Fred says that his father raped his siblings with the justification that, well, I made you and therefore I'm entitled to take what I want from you. If this abuse that Fred West said happened is true, then this was the norm for Fred West. As we'll go on to discuss shortly, there are elements within Fred West's crimes where he's consistently displaying this type of behaviour, this type of dominance and control and treating people like objects and taking from them whatever he wants to satisfy his own needs. However, his brother Doug claims that none of this abuse took place and that Fred simply made it all up. Now, if this version of events is true, it's simply a case of Fred West trying to justify his actions to the world. What he's saying is, yes, I did a bad thing, but I couldn't help it because of what I've been through, because of my experiences. Sometimes offenders act spontaneously, and it's only really after the crime that they look back on it. They then tend to search for meaning and for understanding and think of ways that they can justify their actions. If this is the case, then he was the real victim here. You know, he's portraying himself as being the real victim and that he only did that because that's how he was treated growing up. What he's saying is that this was normal and therefore not wrong. Fred West has been described as being quite a charming man from about the ages of 16, 17 when he started to mature a little bit. But that charm and that wit was always used to manipulate people of the opposite sex and to get whatever he wanted from them. It was always about getting them to do something for his pleasure. He was involved in a motorcycle accident when he was 17 years old, and the accident left him in a coma for a week. He had several broken bones and a skull fracture. The skull fracture could have led to some form of brain damage or brain injury, which would have significantly contributed to his social interactions and the way that he treated other people, and of course the ways that he behaved and interacted in a sociable way. At the age of 20, his sister, Kitty, told her mother that Fred had been raping her. She claimed that she'd become pregnant as a result of these rapes. He was always described as being quite aggressive with the opposite sex. This was at quite an early age when he raped his sister, who was 13 years old. When he was arrested by the police for that offence and asked, "Did you rape your sister?" he said, "Yes, but doesn't everybody do that?" So Fred believed that this was some kind of normal behaviour. And this could suggest that the alleged abuse did in fact take place. This was certainly normal within Fred West's understanding of what family life was meant to be like, at least. He describes that his father had took sexual activity for his own gratification from his sisters, and he just seen that as a normal way of treating the opposite sex. However, his sister refused to testify and the case was eventually dropped. When his physician was testifying in court on Fred's behalf, he said that he was suffering violent epileptic fits and fits of rage, and so there was clearly some type of brain damage left that would have left him with at least fits from that. Fred West escaped a jail sentence for the rape of his sister, but he was still a convicted child molester and he was convicted for sexual abuse at a very young age. Following that, he moved out, and although he reconciled with his parents, his relationship with most of the family remained quite fraught. His early life was all about habitually taking what he wanted from women. And this could have possibly been learned from his father and his mother when he'd gone on to rape another person himself, there was no real punishment and there were no real consequences for that. He soon met Catherine Costello, who was better known as Rena, and after dating a short while, she moved back up to Scotland. When they met again, they married. Catherine was already pregnant with an Asian man's child at that time. To explain the child's mixed ancestry, Rena and Fred claimed that Charmaine, this firstborn, was simply adopted. They also had a child together themselves who was called Anne-Marie. They had a nanny, Isa McNeil, to help Catherine with the children. Isa said that Catherine, or Rena, was a considerate mother, but that Fred West treated the children very harshly. The children were kept on the bottom of a bunk bed with bars surrounding them, and they were only allowed out once Fred had left for work for the day. The family then became friends with Anne McFall, who was a friend of Isa's, and she ended up spending a lot of time with them. Fred later admitted to having engaged in numerous affairs in the early years of his marriage, and he fathered at least one illegitimate child with another woman. When Rena learned of that, she began an affair of her own, and that was with John McClellan. Fred walked in on them one day and punched Rena in the face. McClellan punched him back in the face in response, but West didn't fight back very much towards him. McClellan witnessed many bruises on Rena, and also witnessed Charmaine ask Fred for an ice cream off the ice cream van that he drove, and Fred had hit her around the head. That triggered McClellan to beat Fred West up again. This suggests that Fred West was aggressive and very controlling. However, he only directed it towards those he could easily overpower. In 1965, Fred accidentally ran over a boy in his ice cream van and killed him in Glasgow. He was cleared of any wrongdoing by the police, but that family decided to then move to avoid any hostile reaction by the people in the area. He moved to a caravan in Gloucester with Charmaine, Anne-Marie, and was joined 2 months later by Rena. Their nanny, Anne McFall, and her friend Isa McNeil also joined them. Anne and Isa had decided to move in with them in the hope of finding some work. Shortly after the move down south, Fred found employment driving a lorry for a local abattoir. He became increasingly dominant and controlling with all three women, and he had extreme mood swings. Fred also allegedly physically attacked Charmaine on a number of occasions, going on to sexually abuse her. He's said to have encouraged Rena to return to prostitution to make money for the family. This shows that to Fred, sex was a commodity to be sold, and Rena grew tired of his constant abuse and of his control and manipulation, and so phoned her former boyfriend to come and get all three women and the two children. So then McClellan and Isa's boyfriend had planned to drive down to get the girls. But Anne McFall had become infatuated by Fred, and he'd promised to marry her. When the two men arrived, a fight broke out, which resulted in the police being called out. And McFall had told the other two women that she wanted to stay with Fred and take care of the two children. Fred threatened to kill Rena if he ever saw her again after that. Rena frequently travelled to England to visit Charmaine and Anne-Marie. Despite initially maintaining her friendship with McFall, Rena soon began to resent being around her daughters. So on the 11th of October, in an act of resentment, Rena stole some belongings from Fred's caravan and returned to Glasgow. She was arrested the following month and was sentenced to 3 years probation. Fred testified at the hearing, admitting that he and McFall were living together, but falsely claiming McFall intended to return to Scotland immediately. Instead, she moved in with him. So at the age of 18, Anne McFall fell pregnant with her first child. Anne McFall was never reported missing, but her dismembered remains were found buried at the edge of a cornfield. Fred West started to record a journal. And when somebody starts a journal, they have something significant to record in it, or at least they feel they do. They believe that they're part of an important story that needs to be told. In Fred West's case, he talks about Anne McFall, the nanny's friend who was living with them, who he'd promised to marry. Although Fred was quite low in intelligence, he was a really good storyteller. And when we read Fred West's journal, it is quite difficult to read because of that low intelligence level. IQs of anywhere between 85 or below normally requires some sort of special schooling or special teaching, and concepts such as love and relationship become much more difficult for them. But Fred West did have a low IQ score, and he could tell a good story though. So although the passages are quite difficult to read because of the spelling and the grammar errors, I'll translate it in the way that Fred West would have intended it to sound. He writes about his love for Anna. He writes, "When Anna comes back from Jen's and had told me that she was going to have my baby, my world slowed down. Anna and I were on cloud 9. She was so happy and joyful. All she did was kept kissing me and saying, 'I will love you forever and ever.' It was the baby. I had to sort it out with Anna. But not now, as Anna is too happy. She was pregnant. I hope not. I had to sort out the marriage. I had to marry Anna. She's my special angel. I got my guitar out and I sat on the step of the caravan. Anna sat by me and I sang to her." So in that passage, he writes about his torn feelings between loving Anna and her being his special angel, and being torn, hoping that she's wrong about being pregnant. He makes passing comment that he had to sort it out, with no explanation or expansion on what it might have been. Behind that idyllic picture that Fred West is creating in this journal, there was a lot of violence. There was a lot of manipulation, control, abuse and rape. Anna, as I said, was never reported missing, but she was found buried in a field nearby where she was living with Fred. She was only 18 at the time, and she was 8 months pregnant when she'd been killed. The baby had been cut from her and was buried beside her. Fred had given such care and significance to this child that he's seen this child as being worthy of having its own separate burial. That's why he would have buried the child separate to Anna, because it held a great deal of significance to him. By painting a picture of this idyllic loving relationship and being so happy that they were on cloud 9, there was a very violent and dark behaviours going on behind and very shortly after the moment that he killed her. And this is what many people will do. Many people on social media these days will portray one face to the world of this idyllic, happy life, post pictures at the time of beautiful homes and a big house or a lovely car or expensive family holidays where everybody's smiling and looking really happy. But sometimes when the doors are closed and the cameras are off, there may very well be psychological abuse, violence, rape, dominance, control, coercive behaviour and so on. So what goes on behind the scenes isn't always what is portrayed to the world. What people see is what the storyteller or the Facebook post wants the public to see. Anne McFall was a problem that needed to be dealt with. Her limbs had been carefully removed and some bones were missing from her body that are likely to have been kept by Fred as keepsakes. The baby had been removed from her and given a separate burial beside her. And that's significant because it indicates that he felt the baby was worthy of having its own separate burial. So the following month, Rena returned to live with Fred and the couple relocated to another caravan park. The relationship did improve initially, but Rena ended up leaving again the following year and leaving the children in his care again. On these occasions when Fred had no woman to supervise and to care for these girls, he temporarily placed them in the care of Gloucester Social Services. I don't believe that he had any significant or successful interpersonal relationships. He lived a very dysfunctional life up to this point, and he was aggressive and he was controlling and he was manipulative with the women and the children. I believe that he kept the children so that he could use them as tools to manipulate other people. He could be very charming and draw women in with this characteristic love bombing technique, which is typical of what narcissists do. However, after he's killed these people, he shows absolutely no remorse for it, which is typical of a psychopath. There are more details about his upbringing and his early life. However, I'll talk about these as I talk you through the timeline of events. So, Fred first met Rosemary West when she was just 15 years old. Fred was 12 years older than her. Fred very quickly discovered that although she'd never had a boyfriend, she was clearly very promiscuous. He also told her that he and his two daughters had been abandoned by his wife. And he probably told her this to gain her sympathy. Again, he's using the children as tools to draw Rosemary in. Within weeks of the two meeting, she agreed to become a nanny to his children as long as he gave her money that she could give to her parents so that they didn't know she wasn't working in the shop that she previously was. After a few months, she introduced Fred to her parents as her boyfriend. Rose's mother was very unimpressed with Fred's arrogant behaviour and his attitude, and she told her daughter that he was a pathological liar. Rose's father was schizophrenic. He spoke out very strongly against their relationship. It is alleged that he had sexually molested Rose, and Rose went against her parents' orders and continued to date Fred West. Her parents phoned social services to report that their 15-year-old daughter was dating an older man and believed that she'd begun to engage in prostitution from his caravan. In response, Rose was placed in a home for troubled teenagers in Cheltenham, and she was only allowed to leave there under very controlled conditions. When she was allowed to return home to visit her parents at the weekends, Rose always took the opportunity to go back and visit Fred. On her 16th birthday, Rose left that home for troubled teenagers and returned to her parents. She only returned to them because Fred was serving a 30-day sentence for theft and an unpaid fine. Rose's father made one final effort to prevent his daughter from seeing Fred, and Rose was examined by a police surgeon in 1970 who confirmed that she was pregnant. In response, Rose was again placed into care, but was discharged very shortly after because she promised that she would terminate the pregnancy and return to live with her family. But instead, Rose opted to move in and live with Fred West, resulted in her father just disowning her. People do naturally gravitate to those who we see as somewhat similar to us. It's possible that Fred saw in Rose something of a dark side or some tendencies that were similar to his own. It's equally as likely that he saw a very young, impressionable young girl that he knew he could control and manipulate. This is what those with narcissistic traits and tendencies tend to do. They look for characteristics in people that show vulnerabilities. Younger females are much more impressionable than older ones. He may have noted the strained relationship between her and her father and placed himself in the role of being the loving, protective one towards her in order to draw her in more. Now, we can't really say one way or the other that Rose would or wouldn't have gone on to show sadistic tendencies without the presence of Fred. On one occasion, very shortly after Rena had visited to check on her children, she was killed. She was strangled by Fred, possibly while she was intoxicated in the back of his car. It's likely that she would have been sat in the car having a heated discussion. Something she'd said had absolutely enraged Fred West, and he turned and he strangled her in the car. Rena's body was extensively dismembered, placed into plastic bags, and buried close to a cluster of trees. Again, this is evidence of it being something, a problem which needed to be sorted out. Rena's sister claims that she was going to ask for the children back, which would have enraged Fred. What he did was a very hard way to dispose of a body, and it would have meant considerable time was spent with her body after he killed her. He would have had to drag her body out of the car first to dismember her, meaning that the location that he cut up and dumped the body would have been probably chosen very carefully to avoid being seen or caught by anyone. Less than 6 months later, they married, Fred and Rose. Later that year, they gave birth to May Ann. Shortly after giving birth to a second child, Rose started to engage in prostitution. Charmaine and Anna were treated very cruelly by Rose. She constantly criticised them and used to beat them whilst they were under her care. Anna almost always cried, but Charmaine was a very strong-willed child and she refused to cry, which irritated Rose a lot. I personally think that Rose was causing these two children to be upset because she was frustrated at the situation that she was in. Instead of dealing with this frustration and anger in any sort of a reasonable way, she chose to take it out on the children. In my opinion, the two children were a means that she used to be with Fred. She didn't take care of the children, she used them. When she was left to take care of the children on her own, she no longer had Fred, and the children were simply a burden to her. Despite the years of neglect and abuse, Charmaine remained resilient and would comfort Anne-Marie. Anne-Marie later recollected that her sister, Charmaine, would repeatedly antagonise Rose by making statements such as, "My real mummy wouldn't swear or shout at us," in response to some of Rose's scathing language towards them. A childhood friend of Charmaine's named Tracy Giles, who'd lived in the upper flat of Maynham Road, would later recollect an incident in which she'd entered the West flat unannounced and seen Charmaine naked and standing up on a chair, being gagged with her hands bound behind her back with a belt, and Rose was stood alongside her with a large wooden spoon in her hand. According to Giles, Charmaine had been calm and unconcerned, while Anne-Marie had been standing by the door with a blank expression on her face. It does seem as though Rose was angry and frustrated, and because of this, felt some satisfaction that she caused pain and suffering in somebody else. Because Charmaine wouldn't give her the satisfaction of showing that she was upset or showing how much pain that she was in, it enraged Rose. Rose West is just as disturbed and violent as Fred. She'd been a victim of abuse and she'd gone on to become an abuser herself. She'd been put in a position at a very young age where she had to take care of 3 children. She shows evidence of resenting Charmaine and Anne-Marie and regularly took her anger and her frustration out on them. Anne-Marie had given her the satisfaction of knowing that she'd hurt her by crying, but Charmaine wouldn't give her that satisfaction and she was very antagonistic towards Rose. She endured all of the beatings and all of the punishments with an unexpressive response on her face. Rose wanted to hurt her and she was incredibly frustrated that she wasn't able to. Rose killed Charmaine before Fred was released from prison. Shirley Giles stated that after the family had vacated the flat above the West where they lived with their daughter, Tracy and Charmaine were friends. And on one day in June, she testified that she'd brought Tracy to visit Charmaine because they were moving, only for Tracy to be told by Rose she's gone to live with her mother and bloody good riddance. Rose had told everybody that Charmaine had gone back to live with her mother. When Fred was released from prison on the 24th of June, he reassured Anne-Marie's concerns by saying that her mother had collected Charmaine and returned to Scotland with her. Anne-Marie recollected that when she asked why her mother had collected Charmaine and not her, Fred very callously replied, "She wouldn't want you, love. You're the wrong colour." Charmaine was killed by Rose and her body was put in the coal shed. When Fred returned home from being in prison, he buried her in the back garden. Rather than report her to the authorities, he dismembered her body and buried it in their garden. And this shows, again, that whenever there was a problem that needed sorting out, he just did whatever was necessary to sort it out. There was very little emotional connection between him and Charmaine. He'd always used the children as a tool to have power and control over others and to draw people in. He'd already killed Anna, who was pregnant with his child at that point, and handling bodies and dismembering them wasn't at all shocking or upsetting to him. He simply had no emotional connection, which is indicative of psychopathic traits. Fred West had already sexually molested her. He'd raped a number of women. He was allegedly raped by his own mother, and he was sexually assaulted by his father. There is a familiar theme running through his life where people are thought of as being objects or commodities that should be used to make money, have power and control, and to manipulate. There was no stable loving relationships, which is also a trait of psychopathy. In October 1970, Rose gave birth to a girl, Heather Ann. There have been some suggestions that Rose's own father had sexually abused her. However, that's never been really confirmed. Only 2 months after that daughter was born, Fred was returned to prison for theft of car tyres and a vehicle tax disc being out of date. So at the age of just 17, Rose was left to take care of all the children by herself. Rose started working as a prostitute from their family home. Rose had her own special room in their home where she did her business from. They also took on lodgers to help to pay their bills. Rose kept the key to her room around her neck at all times, and she had control of the family finances. There were several spy holes into this room and some baby monitors so that Fred could watch and listen to her having sex with several clients. He had a long history of being a voyeur and didn't really mind his wife having sex with other men as long as she didn't get too much pleasure from it and she made money. Again, this is a psychopathic trait. It wasn't a loving relationship at all. It was a way for Fred to satisfy sexual fantasies and use Rose as a tool to do that. They'd also engage in threesomes regularly. They'd always take it to the edge, though, by using aggression and violence, pushing these people that they were sleeping with to the very edge. They used gags and bindings. They used various torture devices on them. And this was a developing pattern in which Rose became involved in Fred West's sadistic ways. She went along with it and she was learning and she was getting pleasure from it. This is a continuation of using people as objects for their own pleasure. Although Rose's father didn't initially like Fred, they became closer over time. They became business partners together. Her father had learned that Rose had been working as a prostitute from their home. And rather than being disgusted by this, he started to visit Rose as a client. There was certainly a dysfunctional relationship between all adult members of that household. They'd exert dominance and control over other people. They used other people in ways that other people weren't always comfortable with. And that led them to raping, assaulting, abusing and murdering several victims together. Dysfunction, dominance, control and taking what they wanted, treating people as objects became the norm for their family within their family. They kept themselves fairly private, but both Fred and Rose raped and sexually assaulted their own children. They had a torture room that they'd used to abuse some of their victims and some of their children. They scared their children enough so that they were too afraid to tell anybody outside of their home about the abuse. They warned the children specifically against telling anyone. Now, obviously, they knew what they were doing was wrong. They knew that if anyone found out about this abuse, then it would be trouble. All of the children were subjected to horrific amounts of abuse, beatings, sometimes for no apparent reason other than for Rose's gratification. Rose was even aggressive with Fred, and on one occasion she ran at him with a knife, cutting her own fingers, and managed to embed the knife in a door. One of the children had told Rose that Fred had violently raped and abused her earlier on in that particular day. But Rose's response to that child was, "You must have deserved it then." This was a very volatile house to grow up in. Dominance and control were normal. It happened every day. Rape and being raped was normal. Both Fred and Rose enjoyed taking part in sadism. Once they moved out of their caravan and they moved into their house, where they had a space that they were able to privately carry out rape, torture and murder. And so that meant that their behaviours escalated. I am certain if they'd not been caught when they did, they would have carried on raping and killing victims. By 1983, Rose had given birth to 8 children. At least 3 of them were conceived by the various clients that she had. Fred willingly accepted these children as his own, and he falsely informed them that the reason that their skin was darker than that of their siblings was because his great-grandmother was black. All of their children had to endure horrific amounts of abuse. They weren't allowed to socialise outside with any other children. They were beaten and they were abused on many occasions. Rose carried out most of the beatings. Fred also beat them occasionally. 2 of the children, Heather and Stephen, ran away for a time before returning home for more beatings. When Anne-Marie was just 8 years old, she was led to the cellar in Cromwell Street and she was ordered to undress. Parts of her clothing were torn off and she was gagged and she was tied down. Fred then raped her with Rose, encouraging him. Afterwards, she was taken to the bathroom. She was given a sanitary towel and she was told, "Everybody does it to every girl. It's a father's job. Don't worry and don't say anything to anybody." The abuse towards Anne-Marie continued and she had to endure being raped, assaulted and degraded by both Fred and Rose. From the age of 13, Fred and Rose forced Anne-Marie to prostitute herself within the household, with her clients being informed that she was 16 years old. Rose was always present in the room when these acts occurred, to ensure that Anne-Marie didn't reveal her true age to the clients. The pair showed dominance and control over all of their victims, and that was even after death. They were cut up, they were placed in various body parts around their house, which was their fortress at the time. So even after death, Fred wants and needs to interact and have control with these victims. In October 72, the West hired 17-year-old Caroline Owens as their children's nanny. They'd picked her up late at night when she was hitchhiking. The West then offered her a part-time job as a nanny with a promise that she'd be driven home every Tuesday. Several days later, Owen moved in to their home in Cromwell Street, sharing a room with Anne-Marie. Rose explained that the reason for the constant stream of men coming through was because she was a masseuse. Caroline also said that Fred claimed to be a skilled abortionist. Owens also noted that Fred talked about sex almost incessantly. Her suspicions as to his sexual overtones were further heightened when Fred boasted that many of the women he claimed to have performed abortions on were so overjoyed with his services that they would offer him sexual favours as a reward. When Owens herself became the recipient of the West's overt sexual advances, she announced her intentions to leave Cromwell Street and to return home. Later in court, Fred claimed that he'd come upon a plan to abduct and rape Caroline and possibly kill her. Fred claimed that this was to see if Rose would be willing to take part in it with him. Psychologically, this was a very important step in their violent relationship. Both of them had already committed a murder, but they hadn't at that point committed a murder or an offence together. Fred was testing the boundaries of what Rose was willing to do with him and pushing the limits back beyond sexual violence to kidnap and then possibly murder. They apologised for their behaviour to Owens and they offered her a lift home. When they got in the car, Rose joined her in the back seat with the explanation of she wanted a girls' chat as Fred drove. Rose then began to fondle her and Fred asked had she had sex with her boyfriend that night. When she refused to answer, he stopped the car and he beat her up. Rose then bound and gagged her. In a statement to the police, Caroline said that she'd been drugged beforehand and she was sexually assaulted by both of them. She very quickly realised the gravity of her situation and so she ceased resisting from their sexual assaults. The following morning, she was locked up and she was told that Fred and his wife would keep her locked up in the cellar and allow his black friends, as he called them, to abuse her, and that when they'd finished, he'd bury her body beneath the paving stones of Gloucester. Fred then claimed to her that he'd killed hundreds of young girls, adding that she'd primarily been brought to the house for Rose's pleasure. Following this abuse, Fred and Rose then calmly asked Owens whether she'd consider returning to work as their nanny. Caroline eventually did manage to escape because she'd gone along with their plan to continue to work for them. So when Caroline escaped and returned home, her mother noticed her bruises and then she reported the abuse to the police. The Wests were arrested and charged with assault, indecent assault and actual bodily harm and rape. The case was tried at Gloucestershire Magistrates Court on the 12th of January 73, but by this date Owens had decided that she couldn't face the ordeal of testifying in court. All charges were then dropped and the Wests agreed to plead guilty to the reduced charges of indecent assault and causing actual bodily harm, and so each of them were fined £50 and the couple were allowed to walk free with no consequences for that action. When Owens heard the news, she attempted to commit suicide. Just imagine for a moment that somebody had hurt your feelings really badly. You punch them, you degrade them, you sexually exploit them, you make it clear that they mean nothing to you and that they're only there to do whatever they want from you. You don't care about the hurt or the pain that they've inflicted. They deserved it. Then imagine a police officer comes along and says, hey, you can't do that. You go to court, you're given a small fine, slap on the wrist, and then set free. Then a different person comes along and upsets you. What would you think? Would you be hesitant to do anything to them because of the trouble that you might get in? Or would you feel justified to do it again because the consequences aren't that bad anyway? And this is exactly the type of mindset that Fred and Rose would likely to have had. Just 3 months after this, they murdered Linda Go together. Go regularly visited their home in Cromwell Street and engaged in an affair with 2 male lodgers. On the 19th of April, she moved into the home at Cromwell Street, and on or about the 20th of April, other tenants were told that she'd been told to leave the household after she'd hit one of their children. That claim was then repeated to Go's mother when she contacted the West to inquire about her daughter's whereabouts. It's alleged that Rose had been wearing Linda's clothing when she repeated the claim to her that day. That is the ultimate show of power and arrogance. She believed that they'd never be caught for it. Their house, their home had become a fortress to them, so much so that they could do whatever they wanted within it and get away with it. It was a place where they were able to pleasure themselves in these sadistic acts and inflict violence upon other people. We know from her dismembered body found at their home that she'd had her mouth taped. They'd inserted tubes into her nostrils so that she could breathe. Strings of fabric found at the crime scene showed that she was likely to have been suspended from a beam in the ceiling. Fred later admitted that he'd altered this beam to suspend the bodies of his victims from. She was dismembered and she was buried beneath their garage. From their later investigations, police and forensic experts concluded that all of the victims that were found in the cellar of Cromwell Street had been murdered at that location, and that, like Go, each of them had been dismembered at the location. 5 victims were murdered and buried in the cellar at Cromwell Street between November 1973 and April 1975. As with many serial killers, there is always a progression of violence, abuse and sexual assault with each victim. There's evidence of an escalation to using various pieces of equipment to torture or to degrade their victims. Once they were arrested, Fred said that he couldn't remember many of the victims' names, but he claimed that they talked to him from the spirit world. And this shows that he still wants dominance and power over these women. He wants to relive the crimes and he wants to keep his victims connected to him. In conclusion then, Fred and Rosemary West murdered a total of at least 12 people. Both of them had murdered on their own before going on to kill together. Fred shows definite signs of being a psychopath. Rose shows signs of voyeurism and sadism. They murdered for their own pleasure and they felt very little empathy towards their victims. They subjected their children to horrific abuse, killing 2 of them. Once they'd moved from their caravan to their house, that became a fortress that allowed them to treat their victims however they wanted to and to bury their bodies within there. That home became their sadistic world where the only thing that mattered was sexual pleasure, dominance and control. Fred West killed himself in prison while he was on remand and so he was never sentenced. He and Rose were convicted of 9 joint murders and Rose was sentenced to 10 life terms with a whole life order. I believe that if these 2 weren't found sooner, they would have had many more victims. I do hope that you found this psychological analysis today interesting and importantly that you've learned something from it. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch. Bye for now.